Hi folks, thanks for coming in today. So I'm Tejas Patel and this is Ford McKinstry, and we're going to be talking about the business store along with Windows 10 devices and basically how to acquire applications and distribute applications down to your devices. So we're really excited about it. I know it's after lunch, so we'll try to keep it up tempo. I'm super excited about it because I've been working on it for about a year, and hopefully it provides a lot of value going forward for Windows 10. So with that said, let's kind of get started on it. All right, so one of the things that we've heard back from customers, IT administrators, all the way to business decision makers and on down, is basically they need an app store that's open for business on Windows. So one of the key requirements or complaints was there's no support for work identities within these app stores today. And really what that means is kind of two perspectives. One is from an IT management standpoint, you're having to maintain a separate identity to actually acquire applications and manage these applications. And it kind of puts the org at risk if someone loses a password or you're sharing passwords and accounts to actually acquire these applications. And the second part about it, as you've kind of heard from the conference this week, is we're making kind of a more of a sustained effort in our enterprise story for Windows 10. Along with that, you also want your users to be able to use their work identities with those applications so you can continue to secure your data and apply policies to those devices that are important to your organization. Next thing is really the support for bulk acquisition of free and paid applications. So as you guys know, within the Windows Store and a lot of the other consumer stores, they only sell a single copy of an application. One of the key things for an enterprise is I need to be able to get stuff in bulk, and I also need to be able to distribute that in bulk. However, having my users go and try to get one-off applications and everything can kind of break the processes within my organization. The second part about being able to purchase in bulk is the ability to use payment instruments that are enabled for an organization. Right now, a lot of times, your users are actually going through, swiping their credit cards, filling out an expense report, and it becomes a real pain to actually manage all those transactions along the way, and your budgets seem to get out of sync. So that's another kind of one of the key, I would say, requirements or things that we've heard. The next is all around app management. And one of the other items, as you know, is being able to actually reclaim and reuse your applications. So today, if you've assigned an app or one of your users has acquired an application from a consumer store, basically, if they ever leave the organization, your app walks out of the door with them. So one of the other key items we want to make sure of is that you, as an organization, can actually maintain that copy of that app. The next part is many of the app stores out there don't offer really support for flexible scenarios. One of the key ones, if you're coming from the Win32 space, is the ability to actually support imaging, support devices that don't connect to the internet or to other services. And we want to make sure that we kind of push that concept forward going in Win 10. Next is familiar distributions for applications. So your users are used to having a familiar place to go get their applications, whether that's actually going into a store application, all the way to if you use a management tool that kind of provides the functionality like a company store portal. So what we want to be able to do with Windows 10 and the store is to make sure that your users are able to go to familiar places to be able to get their apps instead of yet creating another one. And along with that, as an enterprise, we've heard, hey, right now it's really, really tough with these modern applications to actually manage them. I'm having to screen scrape, send URLs out, having to kind of contort the ways I'm using my IT administration tools. So one of the other key things that we heard was, please integrate with our management tools. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. And finally, the last is, hey, great, love store apps, but I do have the needs for my own apps within my orgs that I actually want to streamline and distribute and manage the same way as I do any other apps. So one of the other key capabilities that we hear that everyone wants is the ability to support line of business applications in a manner that works with any other application out there. So with that said, we're introducing the Business Store for Windows. And really what our site is, it's a dedicated site for businesses. One, it's easy to sign up. You basically go in there, enter in some minimal data. And two, it's free to use. So there's nothing to use the actual services that we provide. You just sign up, sign in, and you're on your way. Second part is, this is really designed for the IT administrators. So for an IT admin, it's designed to make sure that they have all the right controls, the settings, the configuration they need to be able to effectively manage all the apps that they've acquired through the store and get them into their distribution pipelines. And the second part about this is basically the real kind of core value is acquiring and deploying apps for your organization. So we will offer flexible distribution scenarios. They scale all the way from, if you're a smaller organization, all the way to a highly sophisticated enterprise. So we offer all the levers that you need to make sure that you'll be able to efficiently deploy your applications. With that said, we're also introducing support for line of business applications through the business store itself, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Moving on, what I want to do is introduce Ford, who's going to actually walk you through kind of what the portal looks like and kind of an initial feel for that.
Hello, everyone. So we've done a few demos of the business store already this week, and so we're going to show you, to make sure you've seen that. We'll lead you through that, but the thing we're going to do here is we're going to show you more stuff than what we've shown through the week. So as we go through, we'll be hitting on a few more points than we had seen before. We'll start with when you hit the portal URL, and you'll notice that what you need to do is sign in with your work credentials. In my case, I'm going to be using a company, Contoso Incorporated, so we'll go ahead and sign in. This user, and this representing Contoso, has already been into the business store already. So when they went to the business store, they did their initial accept terms of use and do their initial configuration. We won't go through all of it, but I'm going to show you a bit of it here as we move forward. The first thing, though, what we should call out, in case you weren't in the other sessions, is that what we're building here is an experience that we think is going to be familiar for this user. They're going to make it feel like, hey, it's a shopping experience that's not that different than the consumer web store that exists today. However, in this case, we're going to make this content very applicable and tailored to business. So what you're seeing here and all the UI that we're going to go through is our current builds. This is what's in our production environment right now. It's restricted to just us to use. We'll improve on this and iterate on it over time. But one of the things that we'll be doing over time is increasing the amount of channels and curation and category types that we display in a visualization like this. But this will give you an idea of what it'll be like. The next thing that we'd call out is that you see the user that signed in up here. Again, this is reinforcing that you are logged in with your work credentials and allowing you to take some rudimentary steps to view your account and get out to do your account management if you need to for the identity that you're using to sign in. One of the things that this administrator might want to do when they're first getting going is delegating access to some others in their organization to also be able to use the business store. So the way this is built is that one person representing their org is kind of on board and get the store going for their organization. But immediately they may want to turn around and say, I'm actually not the only IT person that's doing this. I'm actually going to be letting a bunch of other administrators. So we'll go into permissions and we'll just take a look at that. Again, this is early UI, but you can kind of see that you get this experience to say, hey, there's 3 different roles that we're supporting initially. An administrator and an idea of there's somebody in your organization that may just be a purchaser, and there may be other people in your organization that don't necessarily do purchasing, but they would do distribution. So those sort of roles, and then you can add users into those roles. These users would be users that have Azure Active Directory identities. And so both Tejas and I will be talking a lot about the fact that this onboarding and these identities that I'm showing right now are all Azure Active Directory identities. And if you're using Office 365 today, you already have an Azure Active Directory tenant. We, of course, would leverage and use that. You would just be adding the business store service to your existing tenant. You could set up test tenants that are free in order to do some kicking of the tires of this initially. And, of course, the identities that you have in your tenants work as well. For the business store itself and this experience of doing the onboarding and the acquisition, you do need an Azure Active Directory tenant. Not every user in your organization will need it, and we'll cover that in just a second. Any type of Azure Active Directory subscription will work, including free. I think those were all the points. Yeah. Get us rolling. We're going to do kind of an interactive session here. Encourage you all, as you started asking questions, to do so as we go. This is about you guys understanding what we're doing, and we want to make sure you get what you need out of this session.
Absolutely. So kind of as Ford was mentioning, this requires an Azure AD account. So as a part of the sign-up process into the business store, if you don't already have Azure AD, we'll get you signed up for free for Azure AD. So you can try it out with the test accounts, as Ford was mentioning, and kind of a variety of different environments that you may be using. The second part about it is when you're first logging into the portal, you have to be a member of the Azure AD Enterprise Admin Group. That'll enable you effectively to get access to any service, but from there, what you'll be able to do is then delegate access to the specific users that you want to be able to manage the business store itself. Now from there, on the delegation side of the house, basically what we're taking a look at is 3 basic roles. So of course, Enterprise Admin will always have access to all settings within the business store. From there, basically the business store admin has the control over the superset of functionality within the store itself. That includes being able to configure management tools, being able to obviously delegate down to other individuals that might need access to it, and also being able to control all of the display of what's in the inventory and perform several other actions that others may not be able to. One of the other things that we've also heard is being able to provide more controls over who's responsible for doing acquisitions of software, managing payment instruments, setting up purchase orders, and to be able to partition those from people that just actually distribute the applications. So one of the roles that we've introduced within there is called the purchaser role. So think about it as an equivalent to a billing admin, and really all they're responsible for is making sure that all the bills are coming in, payments are happening, and everything else is going on. So they just manage the financials of what's been acquired, how many need to be acquired, so you have more controls of understanding what's happening within your organization. The second part is about the distributor role. So this is a kind of a smaller role right now, and obviously over time we'll evolve those to meet your needs. But effectively, the distributor can't do any admin actions, cannot do any purchase, but they're responsible for making sure that the apps can get distributed out to users within your organization. So that's kind of the high level. Now, as I mentioned, we'll continue to evolve, but it really just kind of breaks down into the 3 basic categories. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Ford to talk about finding apps.
8. Yeah. So as we noted, my mouse went dead. There it is. In the kind of the shopping experience, this will get richer over time. There's some other things I didn't point out here around the things that you would expect, like search, as well as filters and categories. And that kind of leads me to what I was saying to the folks that showed up a little earlier in the room, which is we have these surveys sitting out here, and there's very important information that you guys could give us that would help us make a store that works well for you. And one of the primary things we need is for you to write down the applications you actually want to find when you go to the store. And that can inform us how we customize and make this experience richer. As you know, in the existing consumer web store, there's things like categories. We haven't even started showing that yet in this pre-release UI, because we want to inform how we do that from feedback from you all. Of course, we've got many channels for feedback, and we've heard a lot of feedback to date, but you guys can really help influence what we build here. So please do fill out that survey for us and just leave it in the room. We'll get it before you go. The other thing that Tejas spoke to for a minute is the custom LOB apps support. And you notice in this experience, you might, if you were paying attention to that, and that's important to you, you might say, well, where are those? And the answer is they don't come in through this shopping experience. This shopping experience, the way we've built it right now, is essentially what we call retail apps. These are the apps that are generally available to anybody that's using the store across different organizations. Custom LOB apps are going to be isolated to just your organization, and we'll cover that in more detail, but it wouldn't show up here. That's all I had. Oh, do you want me to click through? Sorry, I forgot to. Okay.
All right. So as Ford was mentioning, so kind of in the business store and the experience of the content we want to get, that'll come in over a period of time. You guys will really help us kind of inform which ISVs we reach out to. But one of the key points with the business store is the business store actually complements the Windows store. And what that means is, as you heard probably last week at the Build event, kind of the types of applications, the platforms that will be supported, basically the business store will support the same set of platforms the Windows store does. So as soon as the Windows store supports a new platform, the business store will support it at the same time. And that means kind of several different application types. So one is the universal Windows applications that were just talked about last week. And really what that is, if you haven't heard, is basically now for desktop and mobile as a developer, you'll be able to create one app. That app will now be able to run on mobile as well as on the desktop SKUs of Windows, and basically kind of streamlines the process for ISVs, but also makes it very easy for you to deploy because you're actually going to just say, hey, here's the following app. You don't really need to think about the platform, which device types you're deploying to. You'll just be able to say, deploy to all. From there, we'll also in the store be supporting, I wouldn't say quite legacy, but the current apps that are in the Windows Store with Windows 8.1, and that includes apps for Windows 8 Desktop and also applications for Windows Phone 8 apps. So those apps will move forward onto Windows 10 as well. The next part that we're going to talk about is the Universal Windows Platform Bridge apps, and that's a pretty long acronym, but effectively what that meant was at Build, we talked about several different things. One was how to support Windows 32 applications, and we introduced the concept of app bridges. App bridges will enable someone that has specifically a Windows 32 application to actually get that ported to work in the store. So you'll be hearing more details about that in the next several months, but that's one of the app bridges. The second type of app bridge is also for Android, so that's another one that was announced last week as well. So you'll be able to basically, as a developer, if you develop, take your Android application, port it over, and then basically submit it to the store, and it'll be just like any other application out there. Now, one of the caveats, though, is that the apps that we do enable in the business store will only work on Windows 10 devices and Plus going forward. So what that means is if there's an app that's in the Windows 10 business store, it won't necessarily run on Windows 8, 8.1, or even Windows 7. They're really designed to start going forward with 10 Plus. Next part is all about the applications in the business store. So at Build last week, we introduced a new streamlined Dev Center, which enables basically a developer to submit applications both for phone, desktop, and any of these other new types of applications that we're going to enable. Now, for the business store, one of the key things is, as I was mentioning before, is that we actually complement the Windows Store. So what that really means is when an application is submitted, the application by default will be enabled for the business store as well. So if there's some application out there, well, I'll just take OneNote, for example, because that's ours. As soon as the developer within Microsoft clicks a checkbox to say, submit the application, not only will it show up inside of the retail store, it'll actually show up in the business store as well. From there, we heard also a lot of complaints, if you guys are interested in the Dev Center, that it was a really complicated procedure to actually get apps into the store. So hopefully now going forward, the experience is much more smoother for a developer to actually submit those applications into the app stores themselves. And the final point is one of the new features that we're introducing with our business store is the ability to use that same process that any other ISV uses out there to actually be able to submit line of business applications. Now, when we're talking about line of business applications, they're really applications that are developed by IT developers within your own organization. So if you have a custom app that does, let's just say, inventory management or something else, you now as an ISV or actually as an IT developer can submit an app the same way any other application is submitted through the store. Question?
So when you publish as a developer, when you publish to the retail store or public Windows store?
That's a great question. So the question was, when you as a developer publish to the store, would you publish to the retail catalog? And we'll talk about that workflow in just a second. So really what ends up happening is when you actually submit the application underneath there, there's kind of a couple of things that happen. So one is the apps themselves, when they're submitted, are only available to your organization. So basically, even though that you're clicking submit, it's explicitly for your organization. So what that really means is they won't show up in the retail catalog. Users outside of your organization won't be able to access that application. So it's really isolated to your organization.
So the dashboard that you have for developers today in Windows Store, there's going to be another section there that allows them to be affiliated with an organization.
Sure. Yeah, perfect segue to the next item. So the question was, what is the developer experience for submitting these applications? And so what ends up happening is in the business store itself, there's another setting that's not quite there yet that'll enable an IT administrator or the business store admin to authorize the user that's going to be able, or the developer that's going to be able to submit the application. So what will happen is the business store admin will enter in the email address of the developer they want to authorize. The developer then will get an invite. What they'll then do is click on that invite. They'll log into the developer center, and effectively it'll show the name of the organization that they're now authorized to submit apps on behalf of. Once they're ready to submit the app, what will end up happening is the developer will submit the app specifically to that organization. The organization then, going inside of the business store itself within the portal, will see a list of applications that were directly submitted to them. Once inside of the portal, you as an administrator or business store admin accept that application into your inventory, right? So there's kind of two-lock control. Now let's just say, hey, you don't have a business relationship with this external developer, or one of your IT developers is not authorized anymore. You can simply remove them from being authorized going forward. So provide kind of just a simple way just to get those apps through into your organization. Now, the next part about it is what type of question? That's a great question. So the question is, once an application has been submitted to your organization, how are updates handled? Does the application developer have to submit the app again, or are updates automatically available? And really, there's kind of two parts to this. So one is, when you're going through and submitting those updates to the store, basically, it depends on how that app developer submitted the app initially. An app developer can also say, hey, I want part of this app available to 50 of my customers rather than one-off. So basically, once they submit that update, it'll actually show up automatically within the business store itself to say, hey, the following app was updated. They don't have to resubmit it, but they do have to go through and update their package to get that update to the business store itself. So it's not a new submission, it's just making sure that the updates can flow through to your users. Next part is, we actually use the standard store policies for app submission. So what that means is, as with any other app that's in the store today, we do require a set of compliance to be applied to those applications. That includes the standards of malware scanning, making sure that there's no other junkware inside of that software package. So we do want to make sure that those apps are able to be submitted, and when they're submitted, they're actually going through a standard certification process. Now, one nice thing, and how many of you guys have actually deployed Win 8, 8.1 out there today and are using modern apps? Okay, awesome. So one of the nice parts about when you submit an application through the Dev Center, specifically for line of business, is that your apps don't require any additional configuration. So if you're familiar with the side loading story in Windows 8.1, you actually kind of had to go through, configure those devices to be able to work with those applications, both on phone and the desktop SKUs. When you submit an app through the actual LOB process, what that ends up meaning is that that app is trusted, and you don't have to do any sort of additional device configuration for that. Now, one thing to mention, since we are using store policies, there are times where you will require additional capabilities that aren't submitted on the manifest when you submit it through the store that aren't default policies. To do that, in Windows 10, we still continue to support side loading, and the side loading story has gotten greatly simplified. And there's kind of two parts to it. So one is, hey, if I need additional app capabilities that I can't do via default submission, you would want to use side loading. The second part about it is, you as an organization might have important IP within that application that you don't want Microsoft to see. So that's another time or an instance that you would actually use a side loading process versus submitting that application via the store itself. And now what I'm going to do is kind of just walk through kind of just the basic workflow. So one is the ISV. So this is really how apps get into the business store. So first is the ISV will log into the Dev Center and submits the application. Second, once the app is submitted, by default, it'll actually be available in the store application. And remember, this is the retail flow. Once it's submitted to the consumer store app, that same application is actually available within the business store as well. From there, IT admin will go to the business store, acquire those applications, and then they're added to the organization's inventory. Once they're added to the inventory, those apps can actually be deployed out to their users. Now, the flow that we just talked about in more detail was the LOB flow. So now the IT developer or an ISV, if they're authorized, can actually publish that organization. Then the application is actually directly submitted to that org. So it never gets into the retail catalog. It's just available for that organization's catalog, and that's locked away from everyone else. Obviously, only users in your org can get it, and that's all secured by Azure Active Directory. All right, kind of with that said, that was a lot of LOB, some other stuff. Are there any questions? LOB? Yes.
Talk about purchasing apps. Is that done through Microsoft? Like, some third-party app, and I want to buy 1,000.
Yes.
Am I going
Okay, so the question is, who handles the actual acquisition of applications? So in this case, it works just the same as the Windows Store. So you're actually purchasing the app via Microsoft, and when then Microsoft will reimburse the actual third party for that application. So you're not having to. That's right. So it is. So the question was, is there a single account for the store? And the answer is yes. You don't have to go to yet another website or to a different portal. It all funnels through the business store itself. All right, one question in the back.
Number 6, as we deploy to enterprises, you're not using SCCM, that's where your public SDK comes in play for all the business.
Sure. So the question was, how did the apps that you've acquired get deployed to users? And we'll cover that in just a moment, but there are flexible options. You'll be able to distribute from the business store, or if you have a management tool that's integrated with the business store, we'll get to that a little bit later, you'll be able to actually get those apps down. Yep.
How lag can it be when you submit to being available to use?
So the question was, how much is the lag time between when your app submission happens to whenever you get to actually see the app? So that's something we're working out right now. Hopefully it'll happen within about an hour or 2 hours. It just depends on how much certification of that application is required. If we do find something that it doesn't quite sniff right, we'll have to, ask the developer to resubmit. So.
There might have been another. Was there?
One other question?
What will be the payment method? Is it they have to pay by credit card, but like buy 1,000 copies of Angry Birds?
Sure. So the question was, what will be the payment methods? And what I'll do is hold that question for right now because we'll talk about it in just a few moments. So the question was, do we have any considerations for educational institutions? And I can chime what Ford kind of talked about.
Absolutely. So first of all, what we're showing here and the way we're branding it is a business store, but it's absolutely available for any organization to use, small, medium, large business, as well as organizations that are not technically businesses. However, like I said, the content that we're making available in it and that we're curating it to highlight here is what we think will be most interesting to a business customer. However, we are making investments to specifically have a solution and an offering. You could kind of think of this as a storefront on top of the store. And you could think of there being a new storefront for the EDU organization and the education market. That we are investing in right now, but we weren't going to talk about in specifics today.
All right, so what I'll let Ford do is kind of demo acquiring apps. And I think some of the other questions will probably follow on from there, and then we'll kind of break it in section and take a few more questions.
So I'm just going to go a few clicks here, and we'll go then back to, I'm going to click on the PowerPoint app. And so then again, I want to point out that the experience here looks familiar to the user. This is what we internally call the product details page. And if I scroll down, it gives a lot of information about the application. We're still tailoring exactly the specifics of this because there's some things that we know we need to do that will be more pertinent to our business store scenarios. One of them you see sitting there, which is these radio buttons to select what license type you want to use in your organization. If you think about online licensing, it's effectively the licensing mechanism that works from the Windows Store today. And what we mean by that is the device is talking to the store services to get its license and to be updated with the license as needed. Offline licensing, which we'll go ahead and acquire, and Tejas is going to talk about this in more detail, so I won't go into it in too much depth, essentially enables the application and the license to be deployed to a device, and that device never needs to talk to the store directly. But we're going to cover that in a bit more specific. So I'm going to acquire PowerPoint for offline use. And the next thing that you'll see here is that we're going to simplify the experience of confirming that acquisition. And in this case, I didn't show it, but when we were in the settings for the business store for the Contoso, this organization has already configured their management tools to talk to the store services. And so it's because this is an offline licensed app, when we go through acquisition, we'll be able to know that that's the best way to distribute that content. So through a simple confirm there, you'd be able to quickly get through that flow. You can acquire an app for online and offline use, and we'll actually show that in the inventory here in just a minute. I think that's as far as you want me to go.
All right, so it's kind of there's a couple of questions in the back, and what we'll do is kind of walk through it. So one is you want to be able to acquire applications in bulk, so you want to be able to get one app or get many apps. One of the other requirements as well is, hey, you don't want to necessarily have to pay retail prices for those applications, whether it costs 99 cents up to $500. As an organization, if you're buying in bulk, you would expect that there's better deals that are out there than having to pay retail prices. So that's something we kind of have to kind of iterate on and get more feedback on what the right models are for each organization out there. So it's kind of an interesting one. Now, the other part is we'll support both free and paid applications via the business store. So all you need to be able to do to get started with the business store, if it's a free application, so imagine if you have Adobe out there, the Reader app or anything else, you can just literally, once you've signed into the business store, you'll just be able to go acquire those free applications. It doesn't really require any additional, I would say, credit cards to be on file or payment instruments to be on file. You can just go in there and get started. The second part is about the financial instruments that we'll support. So what we're planning on supporting is credit cards and then also enabling an option for purchase orders. Now, with credit cards, it's pretty straightforward. You swipe, we give you a set amount of applications out there, and you're kind of finished. With purchase orders, we're still working on it, so we'll take some feedback more towards the end of the session on kind of what your billing cycles look like, but we will offer a purchase order option on there. Now, for purchase orders, there's one other thing that you'll have to go through in order to enable that support, which is vetting. So we have to make sure that all the financials are in order, we know who you are as an organization, and then we're able to vet you to make sure you have the right credit set up with us so we can actually make sure our developers are also getting paid along the way. Now, one of the key concepts from there is the licensing option. So Ford kind of on the product description page showed you two options. One was for online, and the second was for offline. And really what that means is this is a new concept in Windows 10, but really online licensing, really what it comes down to is the actual store itself is responsible for license management. So basically we keep track of it. That data can also be synchronized to a management tool so you don't have to jump to two places to look at it. And then for offline licensing, it's really the license usage is really the responsibility of the organization, right? Because there's no way for us to get telemetry if those devices are never connected to the store. So we have to make sure that an organization is reporting those or is actually truing up to make sure that they've acquired or are using the right amount of licenses. Now, what this really enables, this new notion, is really the flexibility in how you distribute these applications. So let's walk through it in a little bit more detail. So first is the online license applications. And really what I consider this is the default licensing model. And if you take a look at the Windows Store and you acquire an application, just think about it as working the same way, except your users are using an Azure Active Directory identity to do that acquisition versus using a Microsoft account. So it's really the same. So if you think Windows Store, hey, I have to enter in my MSA to get this application, effectively it's the same, but we're actually using Azure AD as the identity to be able to acquire the application. And once again, in order to be able to use an online license, your devices and users must be able to connect to the store services to actually get that application. For us, and then there's another part of it, which is, hey, what if I get this application, I want to reassign it, or someone else inadvertently gets a link to it and they're able to click it. Using Azure Active Directory, we're able to make sure that the user that was actually assigned that application is the only one that has access to it within the store. So you won't be in those situations where someone's just sent a generic link, someone clicks on it, they're able to install it. No, we actually make sure that the user is entitled to that application before they're able to download and install it. And the last part is really about Windows Update. So just as the Windows Store uses Windows Update for application updates, the Business Store uses the same process. So if you've purchased an online licensed application, there's then an update to that application, your devices will get updated at the same time. Now, we'll talk in more detail towards the end about store app policies, but as an administrator, you will have control over when those updates do get applied, but by default, those apps will get updated the same time they kind of hit the retail store. The second is offline license apps. So this is a new feature that we're introducing in Windows 10. Now, there's a couple more caveats here, but it does enable much more flexibility depending on how your devices are connected to the internet or not connected. One thing to note, though, is for offline licensed apps, we do require developers explicitly to opt in for offline licensing. We want to make sure that we're very conscientious that a developer understands how their app is going to be used, how it's going to be deployed. With online, of course, we can because we're backing it, we're doing all the license tracking. However, with offline, since it is the enterprise's responsibility, it will require developers to explicitly hit a button in the Dev Center to say, make available for offline. And really what we're talking, when we take a look at the list of apps and the feedback that you've provided us, we'll be able to target it. Now, what we see right now is perhaps for free apps, it'll be much easier to talk to developers because really what they're getting now is a whole new channel, an enterprise market that they can actually get their apps deployed out to and to actually use. Now, the second part is when you're using an offline license application, this is where it gets really interesting, is that the enterprise can actually cache the license and apps to deploy to the network. So for instance, if you do have devices you don't want connected to the internet, you have devices or situations where your network bandwidth is very low or restricted, you can actually cache those packages and licenses locally so that you can then distribute it via your management tool. And so when you're able to do that, it kind of follows or kind of similar to what you had in Win32, which is you manage the package and you're able to push that out to your devices versus having everyone connect to the store, or you just don't want your devices being able to connect to the internet, period, right? The next part is, we've already talked about it a little bit, but I'll touch on it. Enterprises are responsible for license reconciliation. So you're saying, okay, great. What if a license leaks or if something else happens? So when we do mint these licenses, what we do require is that the enterprise also gets vetted to be able to purchase paid offline applications. So the same process to set up POs, what we will require it for paid offline applications. If that license leaks out there, the license is actually, I would say, watermarked to know which specific org leaked it. So we do, along with the developer, reserve the right to revoke that license from kind of showing up on Pirate Bay or anything, just to make sure that we're keeping the developers' royalties coming in, but also to notify the organization that, hey, something is leaked. You'll be able to get a new license right away, but it's just one other additional control so we can help our developers start opting into the program as well. And the last part is how are updates applied. So by default, if those devices do have connectivity to the store, they'll also be updated via Windows Update. If they don't have connectivity to the store, since you're able to cache the actual app packages and via the sync mechanism that we'll talk about a little bit later, you'll actually be able to take those updates and deploy those directly via a management tool onto those devices. Any questions? Question in the back. So the question was, will there be any customization of that actual application that you're able to get to the store? So that's something we're investigating right now. So there's kind of two parts to it. So one of the common asks are, hey, can I just give my configuration along with it? So if you're using the offline license applications, you will have that flexibility. With online, as you're doing your deployment, if you're using it, deploying it via a management tool, you'll also be able to include that payload as well as you're deploying the application. But it won't be native to the app itself. It'll have to come via a management tool because it's just another piece of data. Question?
Will there be any administrative tools like something like reclaiming the license, like if you're doing a PC migration, you're replacing different PCs, right? But just moving the app from one PC to another, or support scenario?
Sure. So the question was, will there be any sort of support for reclaiming those licenses as you're moving to devices that? And the answer is yes, and we'll cover that in just a few moments. But basically, we offer kind of two experiences. One is directly through the business store itself, and the second is via your management tool. So in both scenarios, you'll be able to do the reclaiming of that application. Yes, one question over there.
Yeah, so the developer opt-in licensing. So is this an option that every developer gets when they publish an app to the store?
Absolutely. So the question is, for the developer opt-in, is it available for any application that's submitted through the store? And the answer is yes. So
Everyone's going to see this regardless of whether or not their app's being used in an enterprise.
that's right. That's right.
Will you have the option, like will there be an option for an app developer who has their app at a retail store, it's designed for online use, but they want to make it available for offline use, but they want to charge something different?
Right. So right now, it's a capability we are looking at. So basically, in the sense that a developer will be able to submit their app to retail. Once it's submitted to retail, they do have the option to actually opt in for offline licensing. We are working out kind of with our developers what that model will look like. But the current story is, they explicitly have to, it's the same price. That's right. That's right. Thank you. All right. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ford so we can start jumping into app management and distribution.
All right, so we'll pick up where we left off and confirm our acquisition here of the PowerPoint offline app. And the next thing we want to show here is essentially this view that now gives you this picture of what your organization has acquired from the Windows Store for your whole tenant or for your whole organization. So we have 4 apps here that we're showing that have already been acquired. You can see PowerPoint that we just acquired is listed there at the top, and it's indicating the license type is offline. It's also indicating that it's not a custom LOB app. So if you look down here and you see this Home Builder app, per the question earlier, Home Builder is actually showing up twice. It's the same app and it's a custom LOB app. However, we acquired it for online and offline use. And so one of the things you may note here is that we also are denoting that this app has been already claimed by 3 users. So if you click on the app and you go in and look at what we call the drill down page for the app, you can actually see the list of recipients in your organization. We know them because this is online licensed, and we know their identity because it's the Azure Active Directory identity. We can actually tell the admin, who has actually claimed this application. And it's from here that you'll have an experience to be able to reclaim. It's also from here where in this case it doesn't make as much sense because this is your own app, it's a custom LOB app, but on the drill down page you'll be able to do things like view purchase history. The reason it doesn't make sense is because this is free in this case. You can assign to more individuals and you can get more or buy more if it was a paid app and you're approaching the limit of what your acquisition has made. And then here for the view app details essentially takes you back to the product details page. I think that was it.
Right.
Go ahead.
So as Ford was pointing out, there's several pieces of functionality that he kind of went over briefly. So one was the obvious one that we talked about earlier, which is how do you reclaim and reuse these applications? So through the actual business store itself, you can go in there and actually manage the reuse of those applications, right? You want to maintain that investment in your applications. You don't want to necessarily have to spend over and over again for the same application. So we do enable that capability within the store itself. The second part that's important about it is understanding the utilization for applications. So we didn't see the queries in here today, but you'll be able to do simple queries to understand, hey, for a given app, how many users are using it or who's it assigned to? Or you can pivot the other way, which is, hey, for a given user, they've left my org, I want to just simply be able to reclaim everything all in one shot. So you'll have capabilities starting off in the business store, but they'll also be supported through management tools so you can do more complex queries such as, hey, the following groups are assigned a license for this application. Who is it assigned to? Is it actually been deployed? What's the latest update available for it? So there's kind of a set of levers that you can use there depending on what your needs are. Second is kind of Ford mentioned to kind of just recap is you can acquire additional seats. So remember, the key point here is for online licensing, we do enforce how many licenses of an application are on there. For offline license apps, we do give you an indicator of how many seats were actually purchased for that application. That data is then synchronized into a management tool, so if you go over your quota, let's just assume you purchase 100 copies of an application, you're sitting at 110, well then, as an organization, you either need to reclaim 10 or go to the store and acquire another 10 apps for that particular, for that application. Now what we're going to get into is kind of the meaty part. So we're going to talk about how to distribute an application, and there's really 2 mechanisms. One is using the business store, and then the second is using a management tool, and I think I heard a question somewhere. Yes? So the question is, once an app reaches its quota, is there a way to auto add inventory for that application? So that's a great question. That's something we are looking at. I think initially we were just trying to find the right dial, especially when it gets to paid apps. For free applications, not a problem. We'll just keep going. However, for paid, we do want to be able to give the purchasers or IT admins on control of, well, how much? So that's something we're taking a look at to say, is there a maximum cap of day? Does it get auto-approved? So that's something we're investigating right now. All right, and with that said, I'm going to hand it back to Ford so he can show you a couple of the distribution mechanisms.
Now the fun part.
Yes.
So I'll go back to the inventory view, and the thing that we showed was acquiring PowerPoint for offline. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. Right now we're going to take this other application, which is the Microsoft Dynamics app, which is an online application. And you see that it's sitting here in inventory. and you see that it is not yet in our private store. So I'm going to add it to the private store, and it's going to go essentially add it to the private store. In our case is essentially what we're referring to as this experience where you can deploy the application. This is one of two mechanisms to deploy it without using management tools. And the idea is that for small, medium-sized businesses that don't have management tools, or for some reason you don't want to use your management tools, we wanted to make a mechanism available to quickly get the content that you bought out to your users. So this is one mechanism. I'm going to show you the UI for that. The other mechanism is what we call direct assign, which is you enter the email name of the user in your organization, and it sends them an email with a link, and then they just click the link and it pulls down the app. For the private store, that added it to the private store. So I'll go over here now to a Windows 10 device. So this now is, think of this as your employee or your student in your school that's logging into their device. They're using their Azure Active Directory credentials. So in this case, Jane Smith is who logged in. She's in the Contoso organization, and she clicks on her store. So when the store app launches, remember now you've switched from being the admin in the business portal to being the employee or the student or the user in the org. She sees the full retail store that she would normally see. And home, apps, games, music, video, so on and so forth show up there. But she sees something new here that wasn't there before. And this is, the name of her organization is Contoso. And the only reason she gets that is because she's been authenticated as a member of the organization. So she clicks on that, and she sees the applications that have been made available for her and for the whole organization through this quote-unquote private store experience. And from here, you see the Dynamics app show up. She's able to click on that and essentially see a very similar experience to what she would have had in the consumer store. In fact, embedded in the consumer store. So that she can essentially complete that acquisition and do what we would call like a self-service motion to say, hey, that app was made available to me and I actually want it, so I'm going to install it. And I think, yeah.
If they went through the standard way, the public way, would they be able to see this also?
So the user.
If there was something, if there was I think I've answered it in my own way.
So one of the things I alluded to it, but I didn't really say it, which is the private store in this Contoso tab is the only part of this store experience that is using Jane's Contoso identity. The first 5, we often call them tabs. I'm not sure what they're really called. Here on the left are effectively using either no identity yet because she has not yet logged in with an MSA. But if she has logged in with an MSA, that would essentially be her retail or consumer store experience. And I think we're going to talk about it more later, but that's a configurable thing that the IT admin can turn on and off and control a bit. And Tejas will talk to them.
Yes.
So as if we have like sort of like a no fun zone that are coming for the right reason, like you don't have games and everything, you just have your line of business store apps, and you have an application X 1.0 that all of us deal with. It's not
You wanna take?
it's customizable, right? It's change the registry. You have to do manipulations of application to work, right? And you package it in, right? Can we still add that type of customizable app to the store?
So the question is, if you have a customized application that was submitted through the store and you want to be able to display in the private store, really what it will come down to is the same policies that we use upon store submission, and the content and the data is going to be exactly what's available via the private store from the private store perspective. So there's no additional.
Sitting there.
Yeah, so there's no additional, there's kind of different sets of configs. So if in your line of business application that's destined for your own organization, you can put custom content in there. And as long as it's a part of that application, that custom content will be available to users within your org. When it comes to configuration, that's something we'll probably have to take a look at a little bit more in the future, which is, hey, can I also include custom configuration or custom settings within the app that says, hey, when this app is deployed to the device, also do the following. That's something we'll have to kind of investigate for the future. Yeah,
Good.
oh yeah. One.
I think the
So the question is, will Win32 apps be able to come in here as well? So this is one of those app bridges that we were talking about a little bit earlier. As soon as we do enable Win32, when you're using the app bridge, those applications will also be able to be enabled here. Now, there are kind of details with traditional Win32 apps, right? So it's a very, I would say, kind of using MSIs and being able to crack those apart probably won't be supported when submitting through the store, so those will have to still be using kind of your traditional mechanisms. But any app that migrates from a more sophisticated Win32 packaging for installation over to using the app bridge into the store will kind of have to follow the same requirements in order for it to display here. Yes.
Will we have control over the tab placement so that when they go to the App Store this way, they will land on Windowsill, for example?
So, sure. So the question is, will there be customization or policies enabled within the store app itself to enable an administrator to be able to control how the store app looks? So right now, that's something we're looking at for a little bit later in the future. We'll talk a little bit more in store policies when I get to it kind of later on in the presentation, but you will have the ability, not necessarily to reorder the presentation format, but to be able to do other things currently, which is to block the purchase of applications, block the installation or launching of applications. But we will take some more feedback to make it a more optimized experience to say, hey, I only want to show the following tab. I don't want my users to take a look at games. I don't want them to be able to take a look at all this other stuff. Let them focus on what I want to give them. Yep.
Current 165 subscribers go to online portal to download the software available to your machine, Windows 10. When the business store comes, is it ever going to merge when all these apps downloaded from here versus your online portal, or is it going to stay separate or both?
So the question is, how do all these different storefronts, whether it's Office, whether it's using the business store or even the consumer store, what's the kind of the ongoing story? So that's something we're rationalizing right now, which is to make sure that for all acquisition of apps, we can eventually get to a certain place where it's really easy and cross-navigable from site to site or even converging. But that's something we're taking a look at right now. Yes.
Actually, just a question on a couple slides back, but it applies to what actually shows up here on the business store. If I submit an app, let's say I build an app that I only want to be available for online users, right? Only for our organizations, not going to be public. If I submit that app, it's going to have to be it's going to pass certification
That's correct. So
before it even shows up in the business store as well.
that's right.
So there's something that goes in there that causes it to fail certification, but we need it anyway for our business. We won't have the option.
That's right. So the question is, if something fails a certification check on submission of that application, what are the ways that we can enable that content to be able to show up in the store? So we're just getting started. So as we find kind of more and more options are required for organizations, e.g., hey, I need this specific capability, or I need this one, retail apps don't submit it. One thing that we'll take a kind of look at is getting that telemetry feedback to say, hey, is this an enterprise application? And what were they actually trying to do? And we'll adjust our knobs and dials along the way.
The reason I asked that is that we use some native code in some of our line of business apps that have sideload, actually, that if we submit it into the Windows store, fail.
Right.
Because we're doing something that we need to do that the store doesn't support.
Right. So yeah, kind of on an ongoing basis, we'll take a look at kind of what we're seeing from our telemetry and then kind of tune what the right dials are for that. Absolutely. All right, and to kind of give a brief recap, so Ford just showed you the private store and want to get to the more management tool distribution, so I'll kind of quickly walk through the next two slides and we'll take questions afterwards, after the session. But effectively, Ford logged in as an IT pro into the portal. He then simply said, click add to my private store. And from there, the user signed in with the Azure AD credentials on their store, or actually on their client device, with the store open, then was able to see the private store. And finally, the user was able to select the application and just click install to get the application down and installed onto their device. So it's really just kind of a low-key, frictionless way to be able to get apps to users that want to do more kind of self-service of getting those applications. And the other feature that Ford had also kind of alluded to, and we talked about briefly, was a direct assign. So in this case, same thing, IT Pro signs in, but rather than adding it to the private store in this particular case, let's just say it's a high-value application you don't really want to make available to everyone, you have the option to then assign that application directly to one user. The user then gets an email notification, and basically sign in with Azure AD. And once going back to the store app, what they'll get is a link to that actual application. From there, they'll just click on the actual install button, and then the store installs that application. So that gives you a little bit more control of, hey, only 10 users need this app versus my entire org via the private store itself. Now, kind of just a quick recap here. Private store, the admin controls which apps are available. One other thing that we didn't really kind of drill into, when you add an app to the private store, those applications are viewable by the entire organization. So no matter who you are in the organization, you'll always be able to see those applications. Next is, we've talked about it, you're going to have to be signed in with your Azure AD account to be able to authenticate against the store to make sure you're authorized and you're authenticated to see the content that's only for your organization. And next, in this particular case, when you're doing app distribution via the business store, effectively all the applications are online licensed, right? The offline is really designed for, hey, my devices don't have connectivity. In this case, you do have connectivity, so we want to make sure that only online is worked. Also, when you're going through the business store, effectively you're doing your reclaim and reassign through the actual business store itself. It's not interacting with the management tool. So it's just a simple, lightweight way to kind of get apps to your users in particular kind of small, medium business scenarios. And we'll talk about management tools in a second. And effectively the same thing for direct assignment. So for direct assignment, we do only support currently the ability to assign apps on a singular user basis. We'll evaluate what type of feedback we get to say, perhaps including support for groups. So I can say, hey, here's my distribution group, send an email, all of a sudden entitlements are created in the background. The users get the apps, they can just click on it and then install them versus having to kind of hand type each one of their names in. Same thing here as well. So the app reclaim and reuse is via the management portal itself. So this is just kind of the simple contained way to get started with the business store as well. So if you're going in the first time kicking the tires, great way to just try out the functionality end to end before having to wire up your management tool if you're not ready for it. And with that said, I'll kind of hand it over to Ford. We have one question in the back. That is today. That is today. So once again, we'll try to get more feedback on it, the telemetry, to really understand the usage patterns so we kind of can tune the features to how folks want to use them. Right. So the question was, how do you, as an administrator, make sure that you're able to manage the updates that are getting out to the devices? And we'll talk a little bit more towards the end of the presentation of kind of the levers that you have around there, when app updates are available, not available, and how you want to manage those. So you as an administrator can stay in complete control of when those updates are applied as well. And that's really kind of more of a, I would say, kind of the classic IT management scenario of, hey, I'm managing these devices today. I'm not ready for this update to be applied to this device, and here's the time frame. Once I approve it, that will enable that enable that app to be updated on that device. Absolutely. Yes. So the question is, do you have to do all that management in our interface? And the answer to that is no, and we'll talk about that in the next several slides. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ford to show kind of what we can also do via management tools.
All right. So this is the last big demo, and this is kind of part A of distribution was what we just covered, which is without management tools and online licensed only, and you manage it, to this gentleman's question, through the business store interface that we've been looking at. Part B is where we're going to go next, and that is essentially you're a large organization that has management tools. So we're going to take this, the example of PowerPoint that was licensed for offline use as the app that we're going to focus on here. And since we already acquired it, I'm going to go over here and switch to my System Center tool. Now, this is one example of a management tool MDM or client agent-based tool in this case that will be integrating with our store services. So we are, as part of Windows 10, and it's new with the Business Store, is we're exposing services that management tools can integrate with. And this is the thing that's going to allow that integration to enable the management tool to do a lot of it, to slipstream into your existing management tool workflows and distribution models that you use. So the store was a source of content, but it isn't going to be the thing that you're necessarily going to use to distribute and govern. So you see here, PowerPoint shows up at the top. That's because the management tool is able to talk to the store and say, what does Contoso own? And Contoso has these 4 apps. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the basic deploy wizard to set up a deployment here for that app. So we'll go ahead and select all users, and I'm going to just make one more change from the default here to say it's a required update, and I'm just going to skip to the end of their wizard and say summary. We'll go next. It prepares the deployment. You see that System Center comes back and says everything looks good. I close that. You also see that this deployment that I just created was added down here in System Center. So that's just an example of, the app shows up in System Center or another management tool that's integrated with the store and allows the IT admin that uses these tools today to have that similar experience to actually go in and actually do what they want to with that app. I chose to deploy it out to the org. You could choose to push it to an experience that System Center supports called the company portal experience, which essentially makes that app available through another app that acts like a store that your organization uses to actually allow users to self-service. Before, I want to show something here real quick on the start menu because it's going to happen. It already started, which is the PowerPoint app is not installed. I'll just click away. You saw the balloons pop up, which is it started the installation of the PowerPoint app, and now the balloon came up that said it's completed. So I'll go over here and show now that the PowerPoint app is showing up as a recently installed app on this machine. So again, this was an offline licensed app installing to Win 10. I'm sorry, what was your question?
Yes. So
yes. I think.
Yep. And so they kind of have 2 versions. So a management tool might have a side of saying through a web portal or an app. Yep.
Good.
So there's a question in the back.
Yep. Make it available instead of mandatory? Yeah, I just did that for demo purposes so we weren't sitting here waiting for a longer period of time for it to install. Oh, so the PowerPoint app, when we went through the acquisition flow, we acquired it for offline use. And you can't distribute an offline licensed app through the private store. So the only mechanism we had available to us to distribute it was to distribute it out of band from the store. We're choosing to demonstrate using management tools, and in this case, System Center. But one of the things, I don't know if you talk about it later, is we enable a UI from the Business Store that allows you to download the actual app package and license, and then sideload it wherever you need to, whether it's sideloaded into your own management tool or sideload it directly onto devices.
Sorry, so I missed the first part of the question.
He wants to get rid of the app catalog and just use the store.
So for offline applications, the answer will be no for that one. But if you are using the online applications, you will be able to use the private store mechanism for users to pull that down from their devices. Now, one of the other parts too is, so we work very closely with the SCCM team as well. So if you do have any feedback on the experience and how you would like to make that better for what they offer, we can certainly take that feedback to them or get you in touch with those guys as well.
And some of us building this experience, or the service interface of the Business Store allows them to improve the experience down through the company portal, because now they have access to metadata of the application and some of the information about what you've acquired.
Yeah.
So
So the question is, when using a company store portal or application, is it supposed to complement what we're offering in private store or not? So kind of two things there. One is for the private store, it's really just a very simple mechanism right now. So it doesn't enable you to say, hey, for a given user, block the following apps or make the following apps available. Depending on the level of how much controls that you want to introduce or what you want to be able to have your users do with the store or not do with the store, basically when you have the company store portal, basically those apps can get deployed onto those machines without the store app being available to the user. The second part is when using a management tool, they have, depending on, obviously it depends on your business needs, but they do have more sophisticated capabilities to be able to target groups, to be able to show certain apps to certain users. And that's something right now that we're just making a simple experience for. But if you do need more complex controls and what it gets enabled and where and what users are able to see within that portal, we recommend the company portal.
does that make sense?
Yeah, trying to figure the placement of where this comes.
Yeah, and it all depends on where you want your users to discover their application. So one is if you want them to be able to go to the private store and that's your preferred mechanism, they should go to the private store. If you do use a management tool already and you have several other platforms that you support in your organization, such as iOS and Android and everything else, kind of building that muscle memory for a user to say, hey, if I need apps, I always go here, instead of having two different distinct places where they need to go.
So it's not a mutually exclusive offering, and it's up to you as the admin to determine what's best for your org. The last thing of the demo, I'll just finish up real fast, is essentially the app is not only there, but it actually and installed, but it actually runs, which is awesome. I mean, this is you guys. This week is the first week we actually showed this off, which is an offline licensed app running on Windows 10. So we're excited that this is all enabled.
And my question was regarding offline licensing. So with offline licensing, basically to download the install license, the only person that needs the Azure AD integration would be the administrator.
Absolutely. So
That's
let's
right.
talk about that a little bit more. So I'll just do a brief recap and we'll talk some more details of offline app distribution. So basically, in this particular case, Ford logged in, acquired the offline application. From there, the application data was synchronized down to the management server. So this was the actual app data, metadata, the license data, and the actual app package itself from the business store. And then from there, the management server can choose to put that content onto a local server, whether it's HTTP or using old UNC pads so they can cache that content locally. From there, the management server will then send the license and the policy for the client to install the application. So there's another great talk by John Vinsel that he gave yesterday on the app management framework. And I highly recommend for everyone that's interested in this to actually, if you weren't able to attend, to actually take a look at that, because he goes into way more detail of kind of all the mechanics, how everything works. From there, basically, once the command has been issued, then at that particular point, the client will actually download and install the app onto the local device. So kind of with that, let's talk in a little bit more detail of what happened underneath the covers. So we are offering a set of services from the business store for management tools. Those APIs will be available publicly to any vendor out there, or if you as an IT organization don't really use any other vendors, you'll also be able to do the same thing. And basically what it's going to be able to do is enable the synchronization of app purchases and updates into the management tool itself. So for instance, if I started off on day 0, I purchased 50 applications, those 50 applications, metadata, app packages, and licenses will get synchronized to your management tool. Then from there, let's just say you purchase another 5 on day 2, then it'll give you the delta sync of what you've purchased from the day before. But if there are any updates to those applications to that other 50, you also get the app updates for that particular application. Now from there, one of the common complaints that we had in the past was, man, I have to go back to the store and scrape and get all this stuff for about the metadata, like all the app details, the icons, and everything else. So using the store services, you're actually able to synchronize that content down as well, so you can more quickly, with the management tool, give the right experience for your users, or the management tools themselves will orchestrate that, transform that to make sure it's laid out properly within the store portal type of tools and everything else. Now, the second part about it is we also are going to enable the download of offline licensed applications directly from the portal itself. So if you don't use a management tool or you have constraints on how your management tools can synchronize, you'll actually be able to grab all that data directly from our portal itself. Now from there, there's kind of another part, and I'm going to speed up a little bit, which is the ability to configure management tools. So another thing here is your management tools also must be an Azure AD application. So the Azure AD guys have way more information on this. But effectively, if you go in the Azure Marketplace, how they publish those apps, you actually have to acquire that application from there. And this is really more about the management tool vendors and how they integrate with us. And the second part about it is the management tool has to be configured both in our portal and also Azure AD. And our portal will just give you a simple drop-down that says, hey, here are the management tools that are available as a part of your organization. Select the one that you're using. And at that particular point, a management tool will be able to synchronize from the business store. And the reason for that is we actually use Azure AD for management tools to be able to authenticate against our services on behalf of an org. And kind of for the distribution of offline applications, there's a couple of other points to note. So one is we've talked about the metadata, app package, and licenses. Second is you as a management tool, depending on what they support or if you integrate with their service APIs, you can specify the location of an app package and license. And this is pretty important if you have branch offices and you don't want to have your clients kind of connecting over the pond or having to go through low bandwidth connections. So the management tools can help you optimize the best places for those packages to be delivered to devices. Also for offline, you can install these applications on a per user or per device basis. Okay, so the licensing of it, you have to pay per user. But if you have kiosk scenarios, like especially in educational institutions, you're actually able to install those so any user has access to the application instead of the signed on one if you're kind of using more of a lab scenario. Now, as we talked about the store portal application, hey, if you guys have feedback for the SCCM team, I'm willing to funnel that over to them. But effectively, it enables self-service for users to have kind of a familiar location where they get all of their apps. And basically, now that you don't have to screen scrape, you can actually have a richer experience because you're able to get all that metadata that they need to kind of visually identify the apps and all the product descriptions, all the localized descriptions, and everything else that you need along with it. And the last part that's really kind of important for offline that we haven't really touched on is the ability to do custom image creation. So to do custom image creation, and this is just the typical one, right? So for Windows 10, you start off with the base OS. What you're able to do with an offline licensed application is actually inject those into your OS image itself. And really, if you don't have a management tool, you'll be able to download that app package and license from the portal. You'll then be able to use the DISM tool to actually inject that application directly into the image. So it preps all of your devices. So you get all your default apps out there rather than having to push those out if you know they're required for your users. And let's see, 1 minute. So I'm going to quickly walk through two things, and I'll be glad to take questions in just a moment. But what I wanted to quickly go over was the online app distribution. So an online app distribution is basically you log into the portal. We didn't show it here today. And then the management server is going to sync data from the business store. In this case, what it's synchronizing down is actually all the metadata about the application, such as how many copies you've purchased of that application, all the artwork and the metadata that's required to do a couple of things. One is if you do want to do that company store portal type of experience, you'll have all the metadata. But two, what it's going to tell the management tool is effectively, hey, which apps and how do I make this work? Second is you'll then send this policy to the client to install the app. And from there, basically what's going to happen is that client machine is then going to reach back into the store and actually get the install for the app. So really what we're doing underneath the covers is we're actually using the store itself for this online scenario. So you're able to get the application installed onto or get the app installed onto your device. For this, though, you don't have to have the store app enabled for your users. So you can do this silently in the background where the user's not prompted at all. They don't actually have to go into the store app. And if you choose to, you can actually block the store app from ever being displayed to your user, but they're still able to get that app content down onto their device. And kind of a couple of caveats there. One is, app metadata is synced, but then what happens in the background, and someone was asking earlier, hey, are there APIs for all of this? So yes, there are APIs. But basically what's going to happen in the online flow is a management tool is first going to call the business store, allocate a seat for a given user. That user now has an entitlement to get that application, and then they're able to simply start using the app as soon as it's pushed out. And then one last point before I'm kicked out of the room is to talk about store policies. And so for the first thing is you'll be able to, kind of talked about, hey, if you're using a management tool and you don't want your users to have access to the store application, you'll be able to block that store application using policies. It won't inhibit any use of the management tool. You'll still be able to push apps. one of the important things to note if you're using Windows Phone 8X or Desktop 8X is that we'll support the legacy policies in Windows 10 to actually block the store application. And going forward, however, with Windows 10, what we're recommending is the store app can also be blocked by App Blocker itself. So if you set your App Blocker policy, if you're just new to Windows 10, you'll be able to block the store app both on the phone and desktop devices. Second part is the blocking of applications. So we'll take more feedback to kind of tune how, as an administrator, you can select to display or not display categories within the store, but you are able to do other things. So for instance, if you do enable your users to use their MSA to get free apps and you really don't like those free apps, or even if you're using Azure AD, you can actually block the purchase of applications from the store using those policies by publisher and a few other categories as well. And then the last part, which is kind of the main one I want to touch on, which is when you're using a management tool, you as an administrator have control of how and when updates are applied to those devices. One is, by default, all apps can be automatically updated from the store. So they'll actually, when Woo has an update for it, the client will connect on its regular interval, get those updates downloaded and installed. The second is the ability to control updates for all apps or on a per app basis. So this is additional policy that you have now as an IT administrator, which is to say, hey, I want to know whether this has passed my usability testing to make sure my users are ready for that. So you'll be able to say on the device, hey, don't accept any app updates until I tell the client to actually go fetch it from Woo, or I push that update to a device directly. And you can now do that, not necessarily you can do it on all apps or for specific apps. So for apps that you say, you know what, I trust this app, I'm not too worried about it breaking anything, just go get it from Woo, great. Or you can have more granularity to do that on a per app basis now with Windows 10. And the second part is for offline devices, if those devices are unable to connect to the internet, you'll be able to get those updates via management tools. So you'll be able to kind of push that all down directly via management tool. So I'm glad to take more questions kind of afterwards. It looks like more folks are coming in, but thanks so much for attending today's session, and we look forward to you guys trying this out, kicking the tires and giving us some feedback. Thank you.
Thanks.